Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this video, I'll be putting forward a thought experiment that comes from Walter Sinnott-Armstrong called The Damaged Bridge and Global Warming, Sinnott-Armstrong's thought experiment on government and individual obligations. As mentioned, this thought experiment comes from Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, a professor in philosophy. Although he doesn't specifically know it, he's actually one of my first philosophy teachers, technically, because before I started university and doing my degree in philosophy, I did his free online course on philosophy and critical thinking through Coursera called Think Again: How to Reason and Argue. So it's actually a lot of fun here to put in some of his work into one of my blogs. So this is Sinnott-Armstrong's thought experiment. Suppose that a bridge is dangerous because so much traffic has gone over it and continues to go over it. The government has a moral obligation to make the bridge safe. If the government fails to do its duty, it does not follow that I personally have a moral obligation to fix the bridge. It does not even follow that I have a moral obligation to fill in one crack in the bridge, even if the bridge would be fixed if everyone fills in one crack, even if I drove over the bridge many times, and even if I still drive over it every day. Fixing the bridge is the government's job, not mine. While I ought to encourage the government to fulfill its obligations, I do not have to take on those obligations myself. So what does this thought experiment tell us? It tells us that there are some cases where the government has a moral obligation, where an individual does not have the same moral obligation. So the fact that the government is morally obligated to fix the bridge, it doesn't mean that the individual has the same moral obligation. Just to be careful here, it's not saying that in all cases where the government has a moral obligation to do something, that the individual doesn't have the same moral obligation, only that there are some cases where the government has a moral obligation, but the individual does not. It also tells us that just because an individual fails in adhering to a moral obligation, this does not mean the government does not have to fulfill their obligations. For example, if we think back to that thought experiment, say we disagree and say that we do have a moral obligation to fix the bridge, even though the government has that same moral obligation. Let's say it's an extremely incompetent government and an election's not coming around for quite a long time, or say that both parties are just as incompetent at each other. We don't have any faith that either government's going to fulfill their obligations in fixing this bridge, and the bridge is getting quite dangerous. There may come a point where you might say, okay, now the obligation does fall upon us. Say we take that approach. That may be correct, but then it doesn't take away the fact that the government still had their moral obligation to fix the bridge. So just because an individual might fail in adhering to a moral obligation that the government happens to have, the government still has that moral obligation. Sinnott-Armstrong uses this thought experiment as part of an overall argument around the topic of climate change activists accusing individual people who don't live up to their own standards as being hypocrites, and gives a argument which he believes shows that an individual can utilize carbon emissions pretty much however they want, whilst the main moral obligation falls upon the government to tackle climate change, not individuals. I do have problems with his overall argument there. I do think there are a lot of individual moral obligations that we do hold regarding climate change. It's not just as simple as just saying, oh, well, that's the government's job, not mine. However, I will leave his article in the description below, and you can have a read over it and see what you think. But overall, the thought experiment he uses regarding the bridge is quite useful in separating the concepts of a government moral obligation and individual moral obligation, and how they're not necessarily tied to one another. But with all that considered, this is relevant regarding the accusation of hypocrisy in the media against climate activists whenever they're caught using resources that rely on carbon emissions. Quite a recent example is Piers Morgan, when he had on the show one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, which I'll show now.
Systems. And
how did you get here this morning?
Causing is,
how did you get here this morning?
A pause.
Get it. How did you get here this morning?
To understand.
How did you get here?
Your car picked me up.
You're in a car. Okay.
Yes.
Have you got a TV at home? Have you?
Can you tell me the
Sorry,
point
hang on. Just answer my question. Have you got a TV at home?
Because again, Piers, we're not talking about the real issue.
I'm talking about it. Answer my question.
I'd like to invite you
simply
to
answer.
come to a rebellion.
With respect, answer my question.
Piers,
do you have a TV at home?
I don't think that's relevant.
Do your kids use iPads and computers?
So you can see what Piers Morgan is doing here. He's appealing to hypocrisy. He's saying, oh, you own a TV, you were driven here, your kids are using computer technology, therefore you're a hypocrite, as a way of trying to undermine what Extinction Rebellion's doing, which is ultimately calling upon the government to do more action on climate change. And this is where you can see how this can be analogous to the bridge, where you can say, well, we're talking about what the government should be doing. Whether you're right or wrong, or whether I'm being a hypocrite, is ultimately irrelevant. It's got nothing to do whether the government holds this moral obligation or not. It may hold that moral obligation or it may not, but appealing to the fact that I might happen to be a hypocrite is ultimately irrelevant. And that's what she did say. She did mention this is irrelevant to what we're talking about here. One thing I always like to point out with this, though, is just because we appealing to hypocrisy is a bad argument, or just to use technical term in philosophy, fallacious, it doesn't mean that hypocrisy isn't occurring. It's possible he could be right. He could be right that she is being hypocritical by doing those things, and other climate activists engaging in here. But I don't think that is the case. I mean, we can think about what in different degrees. The way I like to think in the degrees here is we can actually look back at the original thought experiment regarding the bridge. Let's think of two examples. Say there's a person who is calling upon the government to fix this bridge, and they're a worker, and they have to get to their job by crossing this bridge every day. There happens to be no other bridges that he can cross. He can't do anything else to avoid going over the bridge to going to work. There's no other jobs he can get which don't involve going over the bridge. He's stuck there. If he doesn't cross the bridge, he's not going to go to work, and he'll lose his job and starve and so on and so forth. So that's one person. I think we'd all say he's not being a hypocrite by saying the government needs to fix this bridge, even though I continue to drive over this bridge. And it's the fact that people are driving over this bridge which is causing it to become dangerous. So I'm a part of the problem by, I'm contributing to this bridge getting more damage, no matter how small. But no one would think, oh, you're being a hypocrite because you're still driving over the bridge. But let's think of another example. Let's say there is a person who wants to go to the cinema, and the cinema happens to be across this bridge. And let's say in this circumstance there are other bridges available to this person. And they think, I could use this other bridge. It's safer. I'm not going to contribute to the too many cars driving over this bridge. But you know what? It's just more convenient. I just prefer driving over this particular bridge, and I'm going to use the dangerous bridge to go to the cinema, just for the sake of it being convenient. In this case, I think we'd be more inclined to say, well, hang on, you're the one saying that the government ought to fix this bridge because it's so dangerous, and you're aware that it's due to all these cuts, but then you're just doing it just because you want to, and you're not making any effort on your own behalf. So these are two extreme examples. So I think you can find that depending on the different degrees, we can make a call on whether someone is actually being hypocritical. A good example that can be used here is another issue of overconsumption. Say there's a person who says the government needs to do something about overconsumption. Let's consider all the issues like obesity in the Western world. It relates to all these health issues. Waste, the overconsumption leading to extra waste, which is also bad for the environment, and all those kinds of things. So I've said, okay, I think the government needs to do something about this. Say I am also I overconsume, and I'm very wasteful myself. Say I eat way beyond what I need to eat. I indulge in way too many pleasures, and so on and so forth. That would create a bit of a reaction. Like, okay, do you really think there's a problem with overconsumption? You don't seem to be behaving like there is. But say there's someone that I don't overconsume, but I still consume. I mean, I still need to eat food, and even then, say like I do my very best. I try to consume only what I need to consume, but every now and then I might allow myself a bit of a treat. I don't think anyone would reasonably want to call upon me being a hypocrite. Addressing the issue of overconsumption just because every now and then I happen to allow myself a treat. And this is where I think this can be analogous to the specific situation of Piers Morgan having a dig about Extinction Rebellion ever being driven anywhere or owning a TV, is that you're just asking too much from individual people. That you're just saying, okay, you're only allowed to demand that the government do something about climate change or to do something about their carbon emissions if you don't use anything at all that involves carbon emissions. This would involve you basically just living out in the wild, pretty much, in the way to actually not use anything, which goes into some separate issues of when the argument is revolving around having the government change where our resources come from and what energy resources provide our goods and services and things like that. So we're asking for more of a systematic change. Not systematic, systemic change. And that becomes more of a government relevant issue than an individual relevant issue, and you can start going down that rabbit hole. But ultimately, it would seem rather silly to say if you can only say that the government needs to do something about overconsumption only if you don't consume anything, or if you consume such a ridiculously minimal kind of, just have your minimal fruits and veggies and you're not allowed to be caught ever having a beer or ever having a donut or anything like that, would seem to be unreasonable. And I think this is what Piers Morgan was doing by saying, you can't ever be driven anywhere or you can't own a TV if you want to be critical of the government for not doing enough about climate change. So the standard I like to apply if I'm trying to make a decision on whether someone is behaving in a hypocritical manner or not is the standard of what can be reasonably expected from the individual. So we just take a look at the particular circumstances and deem what's reasonable. Some people find, that's a bit vague, what's reasonable here. That's true. There can be some cases where it might be a fine line and you can't quite tell what's reasonable or unreasonable. But in many cases, I'd even say in most cases, the line between what's reasonable or unreasonable would come quite immediate to us. Like a good example would be, say, donating $100 to charity. If we went and saw a working class person living nearly on the poverty line, we would say it would be unreasonable to demand that they give $100 to charity. But if we went and saw a billionaire, and we'd say it would be reasonable to do $100 to charity. In fact, you'd say a lot more. So you've got some clear cases where it's obvious. Sure, there'll be some vague ones, but there'll be lots of cases where that's obvious as well. We can also apply this to governments, of course. We deem, let's think about what the government has the capacity to do, and we'll deem, what we can reasonably expect out of them. But this is the important bit: is we can contrast what we can reasonably expect from the government against what we can reasonably expect from the individual. And given that the government's set up in such a way which they take on all the income from all of our taxes, and it's set up in such a way where they all have, the different people dedicated to different issues, and it's their job. They're meant to spend, each individual government member is meant to be focusing on different issues relating to their electorate, and that's what their job revolves around. Whereas us as individuals have our own jobs to do. We've got to spend most of our time doing some other job rather than, focusing all our energy into these kinds of issues. It is much more reasonable to tell the government to try and reduce their carbon emissions, at least at a greater level than individuals. It doesn't leave us off the hook, by no means, but when we consider what the resources and what the government has the capacity to do, and what the means it has to be able to do it, we can expect a lot more out of the government than we would for individual person to person regarding how much they do to reduce carbon emissions. If you want more information, you can go onto my website, philosophycriticalthinking.com. In that website, I do have a tutorial on arguments from analogy and thought experiments. So if you want some information on how to analyze thought experiments, that can give you a little extra there. Also, in the description below, I'll have the article from Walter Sinnott-Armstrong called "It's Not My Fault," which is his original article surrounding the climate change topic. If you want to read that in full and get your own thoughts about that. If you want to stay in tune for more videos, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.